think I was born with the "how hard can it be" gene, which is a topic that I've been seeing trend on TikTok recently. Essentially, it's a term used to describe a certain personality type where you see something that you could just buy, but you have a really strong urge to make it yourself instead. It's both very interesting and delusional at the same time. I've always had a really strong interest in crafty projects. I love DIYing, but the one hobby that stayed with me for a good 15 years or so has been sewing. Now, I actually made this dress that I'm wearing today. I finished it about a month ago, and ever since I started wearing it, I had comments floating in saying that it looked like an AJE dress, which is an Australian clothing brand that I quite like. My partner and I decided to venture into AJE this past weekend, and we saw a really incredible dress that I loved. The problem is that when you make things yourself, particularly clothing, you tend to have a certain eye for detail, and what I had noticed was, although this dress was really gorgeous, it was really expensive for essentially cotton. So I decided that I would make it myself. The dress is really interesting. It has these pleated panels on the front of the bodice, these beautiful leg button sleeves, which I've never tried before, and then a double layer of gathering at the hemline. All in all, it wasn't that difficult looking, but it did have some technical elements that I hadn't really tried yet, particularly the sleeves and the pleating. It also featured this really beautiful pearl trim, and I've really enjoyed working with trims recently, so I thought, you know what, I'm just gonna make it myself. So this isn't going to be a tutorial. I'm not going to show every step in great detail, but I thought that it would be fun to take you behind the scenes of creating an AJE style dress. Everything from sourcing the materials and fabrics, drafting the pattern from scratch, all the way to actual construction of the garment. You're going to help Mummy do some sewing? Yes. Let's get into it.
So the first item that I needed to source was the fabric. I think I ordered a fabric that was probably a little bit too thick in comparison to the original, but it meant that I didn't need to line the dress, so it worked out fine. I decided to order the premium cotton sateen from Spotlight, and it ended up working really well for this particular project. Before I work with any fabric, I always give it a really bad wash, so I wash it in hot water, spin it really well, and I put it in the dryer to shrink it as much as possible, and of course I iron it all out before we get started. The next item that I needed to source was the pearl trim that runs along the button placket, the cuffs, and along the pleating that runs across the bust. Unfortunately, I couldn't find anything similar in Australia, so I had to go on Amazon and order this trim from China. I thought it was going to take a really long time, but luckily it only took 2 weeks to show, and it was perfect. I ordered 6 meters just to be sure, and it was more than enough for this project. Now, I already had the thread that I would need to match the fabric, along with some interfacing to use on the cuffs and the collar. But the last items that I needed to source were the plain white buttons that run down the front of the dress, and a really interesting gold button to sit on the collar. Now, my favorite place for sourcing really interesting buttons is the Sewing Basket. The Sewing Basket has 3 different locations across Sydney, and essentially they're a company that takes on donated items for sewing, knitting, even embroidery, and they sell them at very discounted prices. So I ended up finding the most perfect white buttons to go down the front of the dress. These are identical to the ones on the AJE dress, so I was really happy with that. And then I had a little bit of a search through the metallic gold buttons, and I came across a few that looked quite interesting, so I grabbed them and I thought I could decide later which one I liked best. Now, because these are donated, you don't always find exactly what you need, and you do need to do a little bit of searching, but usually you come out with a bargain. And I actually found the fabric for my denim dress from the Sewing Basket. If you do ever check out the Sewing Basket, which I highly recommend, then I definitely suggest to rummage through the vintage patterns. They're about 50 cents up to maybe $1 each. You find so many cool items that you would never find anywhere else. And there's so many fabrics, trims, notions, threads. It's just a little gold mine. If you've got a little bit of time to search through, I definitely suggest doing so. And as you can see, I came out with a little goodie bag, and my total was really cheap. I only ended up spending $4.65 on all of those items. So onto the pattern drafting. I haven't used pre-made patterns in quite a long time, and that's because I finally learned a few months ago how to make a pattern block. A pattern block is essentially a skin tight pattern that would represent your body measurements, and from there you can adjust the block to make any pattern you like. What this means is you don't generally have to make a mock-up of whatever garment you're creating because you know that it's going to fit you since you've made it from your pattern block. So this has been really helpful in saving time and saving fabric. Here I'm using my front bodice block. This is quite an oversized style dress. The back of the dress is very simple as well. I've also drafted the back pattern with a little bit more ease so I can gather that in with a single pleat into the yoke on the back of the dress. I then move on to drafting the leg of mutton sleeves. This is a sleeve style I have never tried before. I love puffy sleeves. I make them quite often. To be honest, most of the dresses that I make have puffy sleeves. But a leg of mutton sleeve is a little bit old school, so I'm not going to lie, when I first tried on the dress and I saw these sleeves, I wasn't sure if they would suit me. But to be honest, I think exaggerated sleeves are just definitely my thing, so I loved them. And I was really excited to try this pattern out and try and make these sleeves. So I used my basic sleeve block. What I did is cut the top half off, and I used the slash and spread method to get more volume in the upper part of the sleeve. And this means that I'll have to gather quite a bit of fabric into my shoulder seams, but this will give that really cool leg of mutton effect that we see on the original dress. Moving on to construction, I decided to get the hard part out of the way first, the pleating. So obviously I mocked this up on some paper and then a scrap piece of fabric to make sure that I had the measurements right. And once I was happy with these measurements and the style of the pleating, I transferred all the measurements onto my actual fabric, and I spent hours and hours and hours measuring and pressing and then sewing each individual pleat down. Oh my gosh, it took so long. The good news was I made such a wide section of pleating that all I had to do was cut this in half, and then I had two sides for the two sides of the bust on the dress. So I kind of did myself a favor, but oh my gosh, this was definitely the most labor-intensive part. I then moved on to the actual construction of the dress. So here I'm attaching the back yoke to the back section of my bodice, stitching that up with a really big seam allowance so that I can cut one side down and create a flat felled seam. And as you can see here, it gives a really cute look. Then I move on to the sleeve construction. As you can see, I've already attached the back seam and I've serged the edges to make it nice and clean. And then for the front seam on the sleeve, I've measured a strip of the pearl trim that matches the length, and I've ensured that I've pinned that between the two layers so that when I stitch this seam, the pearl trim pops out on the other side. Sometimes I'd have to go back over that another time just to make sure that I really hide all the edges of the trim and I only have the pearls popping out, but it was worth the extra work to make sure it looked as neat as possible. And then I moved on to the cuffs, and I used a similar technique where I wedged the pearl trim between the two layers, stitched them, and ensured that you could see the pearl trim on the other side when I turned the cuff inside out. I also decided to top stitch the cuffs, the collars, and the button plackets as well. I added some buttonholes using my buttonhole foot, and then I attached the buttons using my button foot on my Singer machine. Now, the pleating is quite difficult. It took me a little while to figure this out, but essentially I attached the inside of the pleating section as I would with any other seam, and then I just had to top stitch the bottom of the pleating down with the pearl trim wedged in between, and you can see that's come out really well. For the middle of the dress, I created a really standard button placket, and again, I wedged the pearl trim in between this placket. It takes forever to line everything up properly, but it looks so good at the end, so I think it's worth it. And then I stitch all this down using the stitch and the ditch method to make sure it looked nice and neat. I top stitched, and then I used my buttonhole attachment to put my buttonholes all down the front placket, along with adding buttons on the other side as well. I then attached the skirt piece to the front of the bodice and trimmed the sides because it's a little bit long, and then I set the sleeves into the armholes of the bodice. For some reason I didn't film myself setting the sleeves into the bodice, But it was a little bit of a process. The leg of mutton sleeves have so much extra fabric that you really have to gather them in quite heavily into the armhole, but they turned out really well. Then I drafted a really quick collar pattern. As I mentioned earlier, I like to do this at the end of the process because sometimes the neck hole will stretch a little bit and I need to make sure it fits perfectly. And then I cut that pattern out from interfacing to ensure that the fabric had a lot of structure. I attached it as I usually would any other collar. Then I needed to work on one of the final parts of the dress, which is the ruffled hem. This uses so much fabric. I honestly used every single scrap. I had no more fabric left. But these hems ended up being around 3 meters long. And then I needed to gather those pieces. And then I went about attaching this to the hemline of the dress. Again, there's 2 layers. I felt like I was just sewing through so much fabric. It was so fiddly, but it looks awesome. Then there was only 2 things left to do, 2 of the funnest parts of the project: securing the decorative button to the collar, which I did with a really strong hand stitch. And then last, but certainly not least, applying my cute little label that I apply to every handmade item that I make.
So here's the final outcome. I'm so pleased with it. I feel like it looks so similar to the original dress. Of course, there's always going to be some slight differences, and that's just what happens when you're comparing something that's mass-produced to something completely handmade. But that is part of the fun of creating the garment yourself. Now, I could have easily just gone out and purchased the dress, but as I mentioned, I get so much more fulfillment in thinking about how it's constructed, creating that pattern myself, cutting out a 2D fabric and constructing it into this 3D garment. So for me, it's so much more fulfilling to make it than to just purchase the dress. There's a few details on the dress that I absolutely love. One is definitely the pleating on the bust, partially because it just took so long and it was so fiddly, but also because I think it's a really cool design detail. Some other features that I really love are the pearl trim that runs along the button placket and along the cuffs. And I really am loving this leg of mutton style shoulder in the sleeve area. Again, you know, I love a puffy sleeve. This isn't something that I've tried before though, and I really feel like it's a sleeve design that I'm probably going to go for again because I really do enjoy it. But overall, I'm just really happy with the dress. I do find that I always go through a period of absolutely hating a project before it's finished, and I've noticed that that's a trend that happens when I really love the final outcome. I have such high expectations, and I expect that when I try on something midway through the construction process that it's going to look phenomenal. It never does. You really truly do have to wait until the final moment, until everything comes together for it to look perfect. But I'm so happy that I decided to take on this project, and I really feel like my future videos are going to be revolving around recreating dresses from brands that I really love. So if that's something that interests you, if you enjoy seeing some behind the scenes footage of the design and construction process of garments, then definitely keep watching. I hope you enjoy.